A couple of years ago, Rebecca and I went out for dinner. It was a trying time, but no, it was great, right? We were in a food court and we were at a table for 4, and there we were sitting at the end of the table, looking lovingly into one another's eyes, thinking, what have we got to get from Woolworths next? But we were sitting there having our lunch, and someone came and sat next to us. Completely random person. Has that ever happened to you? Hands up if that's happened to you. How good does that feel? Would you ever do that? Let's just have a quick test of who's saved. Who would sit next to a completely random couple having lunch on a 4-person table? Would you sit next to them? Hands up if you would. Oh, you got guts. Or if there was nowhere else. What about how many more do we get if there were 6 people to the table and they were up one end? Would you sit with one chair in between you? Yeah, that's a few more. Would 8? Yesterday we went for lunch with some friends of ours, and we ended up at the food court. And there are those tables up at Wollongong Central, and I think there's 10 or 12. Is there 12 to that table? I think 10. And there was a lovely couple up the other end of the table. And they had a little baby, and they were feeding the baby. So, it would be all right if we went and sat at the other end, except for the fact that there was 9 of us. There's something about a table, though, isn't there? Something about a meal table. They're significant. And it almost assumes or invokes relationship when you sit next to someone at a meal table. Even if there's something, even if you're at a wedding or a corporate function or anything like that, where you are assigned a table. Anyone been to a wedding? Yeah, right. You're assigned a table and you don't know anyone on the table. Have you ever had that experience? And it's a little bit awkward, maybe at your own wedding? It's a bit awkward until you get to know the people, because there's this assumed relationship that happens when you sit down at a meal with people and around a meal table. Well, so for the next 4 weeks, as Rebecca's alluded to, we're going to trip through the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, the third evangelist, the third book written in the Bible about the life and times of Jesus Christ. And as the Salvation Army, we actually... it's been said that the Gospel of Luke is kind of our gospel. I don't know if you've ever heard that. You may not have been around long enough, but there you go. I'm telling you, it's kind of our gospel, because the thinking is, as you go through Luke, the way Luke writes things, the way he puts things together, the way he focuses on things is best reflected in the Salvation Army's thinking and teaching and being. For instance, Luke has a very definite focus on the poor and the marginalised of society, the vulnerable. Throughout Luke, you can see him always bringing the poor and the marginalised into the centre of the gospel and elevating them and dignifying them. And that's something that the Salvation Army is really all about. So that kind of reflects. But also in Luke, he focuses a lot on food. I love food. And we in the Salvation Army love food. Here in the Wollongong Salvation Army, we love food. I don't know what you know, but we have 2 cafes, 3 commercial kitchens. We have a great cooking staff, a great chef. And we supply food for a number of different cafes around the city. We love food. This is the Salvation Army. And also downstairs, we have a couple of emergency services trailers, enough to cook 500 sausages all at once. We love food. So when it comes to the book of Luke, it reflects well the Salvation Army. I should say the Salvation Army reflects the book of Luke well, right? Luke doesn't reflect, right? Did you know 1 in every 5 verses of the book of Luke describes Jesus heading to a meal, at a meal table, or leaving a meal table. Did you know that? 1 in 5. For those of you calculating at home, that's 20%. So for the next 4 weeks, we are going to take a trip through Luke at these meal tables. And I hope you see yourself in these stories, sharing these tables with different people, with Jesus at the head of each table. Sometimes we'll be confronted and challenged by who we find at the table. Other times, I hope we feel encouraged and overjoyed. But as we travel through this series called EATS, I hope in all of it you see the call of Jesus to share a meal with him each day, each moment, each life. So to give you some background into the first century Mediterranean life, it consisted of families, of course, but also primarily the life consisted of guilds and political parties and trade associations and religious groups and philosophical schools. And each one of these groups had at the center of their meeting a meal. I don't know how many of you have been involved in Rotary or Lions or Kiwanis or Probus. Anybody? In a service club. You know, it's a service club, yes, but at the very center of every meeting they have is a meal, a shared meal. And that is an ancient tradition that certainly the Mediterraneans in the first century held on to. But what a meal meant so much more than just what you put in your body to get refueled. Who you sat with, which guild you went to dinner with, where you sat on the table according to the head of the table mattered immensely in your day-to-day life. For instance, if you were in a trade guild, you were in the guild of basket weavers, but every meal of the guild of basket weavers, you sat on the 8th or 9th chair, then your next contract, the next contract offered to the guild would most likely be offered to the first 7 people ahead of you on the table, because that's where you sat in relation to everybody else. All of life was dictated by meals and these formal sets of meals. So, when we look at meals in the Gospel of Luke, they have so much more significance than I think we first realize. They realized in the first century that when you share a table, you extend intimacy and solidarity and acceptance. I mean, think about it. Those of you who have family dinners, a weekly or monthly family get-together, a family dinner, it's around that table that young people who grow up in that family get to be defined at who they are. They learn themselves in relationship to the others in the table and in the family. Meals, so important. What about first dates? How many of you went on a first date? Oh dear. I wonder how things happen. How many of you went on a first date that involved a meal or food or drinks? And you sat down and had dinner? Yes? Come on, really? Maybe it's just me. Actually, my first date was a picnic. Picnic at Jamboree. Hey, that's an idea. We should do picnics at Jamboree. Young adults, off you go. Where you control the action. Now, living proof. Now, so this week's meal takes place at Levi's house. Levi is otherwise known as Simon, actually, to most of us. If we list off the apostles of Jesus, his name comes up as Simon. But Levi is great. And Jesus invites a tax collector, someone who is socially outcast and morally questionable. We've talked about tax collectors a number of times, but the way they made their money was by skimming some off the top. They would have a quota that they had to collect for Rome, and they would collect more than that in order to pay themselves, and they could pretty much charge what they liked. So they weren't always the most well-loved and well-liked of people, and therefore they didn't hang around with many people that were socially upstanding, shall we say. Their friends were not the class of society. They were the lower class. So Jesus calls him, interestingly enough, to follow him. Now, in the ancient world, the equivalent of Jesus, the rabbi, the teacher, the professor, calling someone is the equivalent of someone offering you out of the blue a scholarship to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. This is Ivy League learning, all expenses paid. This is a massive deal to be asked by Jesus to follow him. Yeah, I don't think we fully understand the import of what happened here for Levi and for Simon. Same person. So Levi is gobsmacked, immediately leaves what he has and follows Jesus. But he's so honored that he throws a party for Jesus and in Jesus' honor. And he's gathered all his friends and he's like, this is amazing. I've been called by a rabbi and I am going to be a student. All of his friends come. The questionable, unsavory, the difficult types. And the Pharisees are the religious elite. These are the best of the best teachers, the best of the best rabbis and professors, the people who teach rabbis and professors. These are the bee's knees. And they see Jesus, this guy purporting to be a rabbi and calling people to follow him, and they see him eating with tax collectors and sinners. Actually eating with them, not just being in the room, but sharing a meal. In this time where meals are so significant, this is an outrage. And they ask Jesus' followers. Interestingly enough, they don't have the guts to go and ask Jesus himself. They ask the followers. But Jesus overhears and he says, I've not come to heal the healed. I've come to heal the sick. I've come eating and drinking. I love that description of his ministry. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, which is great. I'm up for that mission. I have come for those who are sinners, not for the well. Now, if you've been around a fair bit, around church, you'll probably realize that the Pharisees, this is not the first time, it's not going to be the last time that Jesus gets into a bit of a conflict with the Pharisees. And in the book of Luke, the source of tension around the dinner table in almost every case comes from the religious elite, the Pharisees, the ones who are well and truly saved in Jesus' day. Robert Karras is a academic, a theologian, and he studies the book of Luke, and he writes on the book of Luke, and he actually suggests that Jesus was crucified because of his table manners. Isn't that great? Children, when your parents teach you table manners, pay attention. The Pharisees are coming. The religious elite. And in some ways, the Salvation Army, particularly in the US and in other places around the world, has become part of this religious elite group. And we need to be very careful about how we act within the religious elite, the religious establishment. The Salvation Army is known to be an evangelical kind of movement which lumps it in with many, many other churches, which is interesting because in our history we were never a church. We'd never call ourselves a church because we wanted to distance ourselves from the way some churches acted. Nevertheless, we are a church because you can't deny what you are, but we need to be very careful about becoming part of that religious elite and making sure that we don't behave in ways counter to the gospel of Christ. So let's do a bit of a history lesson. The year is 1537. The artist is a guy named Paolo Veronese, and he's an artist in Venice. And he is asked to paint a picture of the Last Supper. And the assumption is, when he is asked to paint this picture, that it will be something similar to what Da Vinci painted. And I don't know, have we got Da Vinci's Last Supper up there, or is it just not working? Just notice there's no slides. Not working? It's broken. Da Vinci's Last Supper. It's a famous picture, and in it, you see Jesus sitting at the table with his disciples at the Last Supper. And it's made famous by the movie The Da Vinci Code and Dan Brown's book and all those sorts of things. And the assumption is that Veronese will paint a picture the same sort of thing, except his picture has to be 42 feet wide, this is on canvas, and 18 feet high. Isn't that huge? 18 feet, for those of you who are, well, metric like me, is from the floor to the ceiling. That's 18 feet. That's how big it had to be. Incredible. So, he paints this picture, he unveils it, and in this picture, I wish the slides were working. Can you see if the PowerPoint is there and just not linked? It's on the desktop. Someone really wants to see this picture. They're phoning a friend. He unveils this picture, and I'll let William stress out about that for a little while he tries to find it. Oh, it's just in the video image bin. Oh, you've got to see this picture. I really want you to see this picture. It's hilarious. It's fantastic. Actually, no, hang on. I'm going to do this. You ever had that experience where you have to help your parents try and figure out something on their computer at home? And you're trying to talk them through, you're like, oh, just come and do it. I think I left it here. All right, so there's Da Vinci. All right, so we know that one, yeah? That's a fairly famous picture. Aha, now there's Veronese. Now, Veronese unveils this picture. And yeah, sure, there is a table right in the middle. You can see the table right there. You can see the disciples, the apostles of Jesus sharing this meal, this Last Supper meal. But what's he done? He's gone and added all these other people. All these weird and wacky people. And this is the year 1530. Some of these people are in modern Venetian dress, i.e. in the 1500s, and some of them are in ancient dress from the 1st century. Some of them are, there's dwarves and jesters, and now, so they go to trial, right? The church is not happy about this. This is the time of the Roman Inquisition. The church leaders and the church establishment is not happy. They are hunting heretics all over the world, kicking them out of the church and putting some of them to death. Veronese paints this, and it is considered heresy. And he is hauled in front of the church in Rome, and he's told to answer the questions. And the greatest thing is, we actually have transcripts of that trial freely available. You can look them up on the web. It's great. And I think it's excellent because Paolo Veronese is a bit of a smart aleck. Because they say, Veronese, why did you paint all these extra figures in here? And in fact, they're really upset because over here there's some drunken Germans. How dare you? This is a sacred meal. How dare you? And Veronese's answer is, well, I had extra canvas. It's great. You can read that, it's a good story. But it's very true. They tell Veronese, you've got 3 months to fix it. So he goes away, and 3 months later he comes back, he unveils the picture, and it's that one. Only, where is it? I don't think you can even see it, it's so small. He adds on one of these columns, he adds a tiny little inscription, and it says Luke 5. And you know what else he does? He changes the name of the picture. That's all he does. Changes the name to the feast at Levi's house. Isn't that great? Changes the name of the picture and he gets away with it. No worries, because the Inquisition says nothing after that. Brilliant story. We love to pay out on our Catholic heritage and our forefathers in the faith. The party at Levi's house. The religious elite, the religious establishment, always throughout history, whether it be Pharisees or the Roman rule in the 1500s, seems to fall into this belief that there is a certain select group of sanitized people that Jesus should be spending his time with. But Jesus has no problem at all inviting all kinds of people. People who don't fit the mold of what we would expect and come to have a meal with him. So he says, bring on the sinners, the tax collectors, and yes, even the drunken Germans. They're all welcome here at the table. Sometimes it can make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. A bit like a random person sitting next to us in a food court. Jesus' attitudes to table fellowship were revolutionary. Society valued hierarchy and exclusion. Jesus urged humility and inclusion. Pharisees were primarily concerned with cleanliness and possible contamination by the unsavory and the unclean people of the world. Jesus embraced those who were considered unclean and unholy. And by means of the embrace of Jesus Christ, those unclean people became clean. Because when Jesus is involved, it's not unholiness that is contagious. When Jesus is involved in your life, it is holiness that is contagious. Throughout history, there have been a tragically high number of movements within the church that have seen millions of different people oppressed and excluded or even murdered by Christians. But what we get from Jesus is an understanding of a God with a giant table. A God who invites people from all kinds of backgrounds, histories, cultures, lifestyles to come and find life and be defined in relationship with Jesus. The Church of Jesus Christ should be the most inclusive and diverse community of people in the world. Should be the place where the rich, the poor, the young, the old, the black, the white, the contemporary, the traditional, the casual, the formal, men and women and everything in between should be able to come together at the table of Jesus. Whether they be tax collectors or not. Things that would define and divide us in the world around are laid down. We are made brothers and sisters in Christ, and we resound with the good news of Jesus and his kingdom. And the thing we need to realize when we sit at the table of Jesus is, firstly, it's not our table. I don't know how much you think about that, but it's not our table. And Jesus is always inviting people to come and sit at it, and we may be having to sit next to someone who's a bit random and unknown, who's a bit unwashed, who's a bit mentally ill, or who might be a bit drug addicted, who might be struggling with financial problems. But it's not our table. We don't get to choose who sits at our table because it's not our table. And God is always calling all. And so often he's calling the sinners and the sick, the lost, the lonely, the hurting. They're all invited. to sit at the table. And that can make us feel uncomfortable sometimes. Particularly if we've been sitting at the table all our life with the same old people. All the time. But he's calling all sorts of people. I have a friend of mine who was lied to by someone in the church. And it's not a little white lie, it wasn't insignificant. It was an extreme accusation. And whilst he didn't believe the accusation and nobody else kind of did, it was severe enough that he had to leave that church. He couldn't go anywhere else because he came to the realization and he came to a belief that faith wasn't real, that faith wasn't for him. And the reason he did that was because he could not sit at a table with God. He could not sit at God's table knowing that that same table was open to someone like that. That same table was open to someone who would abuse him like that. Who would lie about him like that. But God is calling all people. And it can make us desperately uncomfortable. It can make us confront our forgiveness. Sometimes, we might get up and move positions in the table. Sure. And that's okay. But I do want to warn us against that, stepping away from the table completely, because I cannot believe God would do that. I cannot believe God would forgive. I cannot believe God would accept. I have another friend who struggles to believe in God at all. But his problem is not that God would forgive anyone else. The problem is not that he could believe in a God who would accept anybody else. His problem was he couldn't believe in a God who would accept him. He could not feel himself worthy enough. He could not understand that God accepted him as he was, with all his faults and failings and his mental health issues and his addiction issues. God would accept him as he was. And God was calling him like he did that tax collector. He struggled with that for years and years and years. Thanks be to God, he now sits in a church and worships with his family. God worked a miracle because he stopped one day and he actually took him months of simply asking God, what, really? Do you really? Do you really? Do you really want me at the table? Do you really? And through that experience, God spoke to him. We're going to sing a song. Anne's going to come and play, and we're going to sing a song that we know well, called Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound. And I want us to stop and listen to God for a moment. One, I want us to hear God say, he accepts you. You are welcome at his table. Regardless of what you've done, regardless of what you've experienced, you are welcome at the table. I want you to hear God say, we are all the same at this table. That yes, God is calling people who you will find very difficult to be with or near. But God is a God of love and forgiveness and openness. If there are people in your life that you are struggling to forgive, then this is a time to ask God to help you. No, I don't think God is calling you to sit next to those sorts of people on the table. That's not necessarily the thing. But forgiveness is required. Because if you can't get to the point where you can understand that God would forgive someone else and invite them to the table, you run the very real risk of walking away from the table yourself, like my friend did. All are welcome at the table. Would you like to sing with me Amazing Grace? How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.